Good evening, and welcome back to Vegas October 1 Sounds. Tonight I'd like to introduce you to a little site. It's on the web, and it's called noisetools.net. And there's a couple of different tools there that might be useful to you. Tonight I'm going to use this heat map, so to speak, or noise map as they call it, to give you a visual demonstration of how sound degrades or is affected by the environment. Because without at least a modicum of understanding of how reflections or absorption or air attenuation or things occur, it's quite easy to fall into the trap of making some assumptions about gunshot sounds that simply aren't true. Now, to date, we've been using a model for the muzzle blast as a spherical propagating wave. And that's okay, it's a good model, but it's not entirely accurate or detailed enough to tell us everything we need to know. And under the hood, there are a lot of things going on, nothing I'm going to get into tonight. But with this little noise program here, I can start to show you how objects in the environment have a radical effect on both the frequency response, the amplitude, and the directionality of gunshot sounds. So let's start right out. What I've done is create a little environment here where I put a point, and that point is a theoretical muzzle blast, and it's at the ground level. What a shooter at the ground level would be 1.5 meters off the ground, and I've set it up so that this is a broadband sound, meaning it's going to contain a lot of different frequencies. And here is the spectrum, shall we say, of how I've arranged this muzzle sound to look like. And I've centered it around 500 hertz, which is a little high for some muzzle blasts, a little low for other muzzle blasts, as being the peak area where the muzzle blast. Now notice I have values in here for the sound power level for all the frequencies up to 16 kilohertz. And when an explosion occurs, you get this broadband signal pulse that contains a lot of different frequencies, particularly since there's shockwave stuff involved. But for the muzzle blast, those exploding gases coming out of the muzzle, once they travel a few feet and settle down, then you get this predominant center frequency around 350 to 650 hertz, certainly below a kilohertz, for the muzzle. And the further the muzzle blast goes, the lesser intense signals get absorbed, and you end up with something showing very visibly around the 500 hertz range. So this is what I believe the spectrum should be. Now don't get intimidated by any of the technical jargon in this video tonight, because I'm going to explain to you in the simplest forms that I know of the information you need to know to get the job done. And the whole impetus of this video is try to correct some of the misunderstandings or assertions that are being made in some channels. And I'll roll those corrections in all throughout the video. So let's start with something that just grabs my mind. When we let's do two different videos and we start to compare the sounds, we ask ourselves, how do they sound relative to one another? Well, I'm going to ask you a question. How many times do you reach for the volume control knob when you're listening to a Vegas video? I bet you quite a bit. I bet you don't just set it once and leave it, do you? Okay, and why? Because the volume recorded on each video is different. And sometimes you turn up the sound, sometimes you turn it down, you set it to where it's comfortable, you set it so the muzzle blasts or sonic cracks don't blow your ears off, and then maybe you turn it back up when you're listening to something that's kind of quiet. So we just do this instinctively. But when you want to compare two videos, even if they're recorded at the exact same scale, You can't do that because what you're doing is unfairly biasing it in favor of one or the other. So be aware of what you're doing. Be aware that, because two audios have the same intensity, it's probably because you've adjusted the volume on each of them, not because of the way they were recorded. So remember that. If you're reaching for the volume control and you're comparing two videos, you're probably not doing a very good job. So you have to continually be aware of this context in which recordings are made. And also you have to deal with the fact that even though you aren't reaching for the volume control, the device that recorded it is. It's constantly adjusting the gain on the recording to do what it thinks is a good deal for you, when in fact it's making lots of aberrations on it. It makes soft sounds loud and loud sounds soft, tries to fit them all into one set of dynamic ranges, and the next thing you know, you've got this recording, which is very, very typical of the Vegas recordings, where you can't tell how loud a sound really is. And so you have to go looking through the video to find a sound that you recognize has a known, fixed intensity, like a siren at 10 feet, or somebody screaming at 3, or somebody talking. And then and only then can you say, well, that gunshot is louder than people just talking in normal conversation. Therefore, it's okay loud, but that same sound over there where people are screaming in the venue is not audible. And it's because the sound of the muzzle blast either faded, or if it's two situations fairly close together, then you've got the muzzle blast in one case being audible because it's a quiet environment, and in the other case not being audible because it's a noisy background. So these are things that are part of the picture. Another part of the picture is that as sound travels through the air, it absorbs some of the frequencies, and it doesn't absorb them linearly. That is, it doesn't absorb 1 kilohertz at the same rate it absorbs 10 kilohertz. Higher frequencies get absorbed quicker, and therefore the further away you are from the source, the less frequencies at the high end you'll receive, which can have a radical effect on hearing these supersonic cracks, because they tend to be dominant above 2 kilohertz, or at least above 1 kilohertz, whereas the muzzle blast tends to be dominant below 1 kilohertz. And then there's this evil thing called weighting. And it's this concept that we came up with, particularly engineers like me, to adjust the frequency response of the recording to better fit what our ears are expecting. Because you see, our ears don't hear everything the same. They hear certain frequencies better than others, and those frequencies they hear are those that we use in our communications, our voice. And so in the 1 to 5 kilohertz range, the ears are very good, or very sensitive, but outside of that range they're not so good. So when we make a recording and it all ends up coming out of your speakers, somebody somewhere along the lines has adjusted those frequencies to kind of make it sound like what your ears would have heard where the recording was made. And that has, again, a big impact on the intensity of the sound and the frequency of the sound that you will hear coming from the video recording. And so all these things come in and make it extremely difficult to come up with absolute assertions when comparing two videos. It's always relative. It's easy to observe in one video that the gunshot was heard over and above the talking, where the talking was just normal talking range. And so that sets and we know that normal talking range occurs at just about a fixed intensity. And so we can then pinpoint, if we can measure the talking, we can then measure the intensity of the gunshot sound. So, without getting any more too complex than that, let's talk about it. Let me show you what I see let me show you the things I know, and hopefully this will make the picture a little bit more clear. Now there's going to be a lot of pretty pictures tonight, and there's going to be lots of numbers, but just glaze over the numbers and I'll give you what they really mean. So here we are, we have this noise plot, and we've selected as a source of a sound a point that is 1.5 meters above the ground, and it's going to radiate out in all directions the same, namely it's a point source. And as I said before, I've selected this is a muzzle spectrum. And so here we have a graph of the intensity of the signal as it at various distances from the point of origin. In this, I have this little scale over here that shows in decibels, and that's a term which I'll be explaining very shortly. Where 140 decibels is extremely loud, and 40 decibels is, getting to be a very soft conversation. 20 decibel is, well, I'll explain that later. I'll give you a graph of all of the levels of decibels and what they mean and things like that. So here we see at the very bottom that this scale is 250 meters per big square. Now, a big square is one of these things. So that's 250 meters on an edge, and that would make, since there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the little boxes in there, that would make each of them 50 meters. And a meter is about a yard. So 50 meters is about 150 feet. 250 meters is about 750 feet. Okay, so this represents a reasonable scale for looking at things in the Vegas environment, because most of the activity took place within a square mile. And in fact, we can change this scale. We can go, well, anyway, we could change it. We could zoom out, for example, and get to well, let's see what we have here first. So what we have then with red is, or go back to what I said, the maximum intensity of the signal, or power level as it's called, SPL, sound power level, I set for 500 hertz, was 145 decibels. Okay, and 145 would be the pink, but we don't really see any pink here. We see some red, which is 120 decibels, and then on this graph the lowest we see is some green stuff, which is about 80, and if we look, the numbers are in here. For example, right at this little region, it's 110 decibels, and therefore it's above yellow but below the total top end of the red, so we paint it red. Similarly, way out here, there's an 84.8 decibels, which is somewhere in the green range, and so you can see the coloring of the map is consistent with the coloring of the legend over here. So in this case, let's see, we've got 750 feet there, and we've got just about 3 of them, so that's a little over 2,000 feet that we're looking at. If we wish to make this a map which showed a larger region, we could. And it starts to look kind of interesting. Now, this website has to go out and calculate things, so it takes a while to get the resolution really good. But at this scale, we're looking at 2.5 kilometers per big square box. And as we all recall from high school, a kilometer is 0.6 miles, and therefore if we multiply 2.5 kilometers by 0.6, we get 1.2 plus 3, so it's about 1.5 miles per big box. So in this case, side to side on that, we've got close to 3 miles, which is kind of interesting. So this diagram would say that 140 decibel muzzle blast can be heard miles away. How much can it be heard? Well, we get to be some purple out there past, let's see, a couple miles, and that would be 40, which is getting to be, you'd hear that only if the background environment was extremely quiet. A lot of the bluish, which is 60 decibels, and that's right at the normal conversation level between people at a distance of 3 feet. 3 to 10 feet. So that gunshot sound is about in the blue region about as loud as people talking. And then you start getting some light blue, which is 70 decibels, and it really doesn't reach any appreciable intensity, namely 80 or 90 decibels, until you get back within that 1,000-foot range. Okay, so that shows that we can use any scale here. Now, there's other factors involved in making all these decibel calculations for the intensity of the sound, and I have to show you what the program is assuming so that you can better understand when we start going to the next well, no, let's leave that for a minute. Let's just ask ourselves, we've got a shooter at ground level, and this is the map it produces. What happens if we change that shooter to 300 feet in elevation? Okay, well, we go over here. 300 feet is about 100 meters, so we change it from 1.5 meters to 100, hit the enter key, and off it goes calculating. So what do we see here? And change in terms of the graph. Things shrunk a little bit, didn't they? So we see that more of the purple has creeped in, and the green area has shrunk, the yellow area has shrunk, and the blue area has shrunk. Well, what are we looking at here? We're looking at the sound intensity at ground level. And since we're now shooting from an elevated level, the sound has to go further to reach us on the ground, and because of the geometric spreading of the sound, by the time it hits the ground, it's softer than if the gunshot had came from the ground. So that all makes sense. So in this case, even though we're at 100 or 300 feet in elevation, 100 meters, we still get some pretty good signal even out here. Let's see, what would they say? That's 5 kilometers or 3 miles. Remember, 5 kilometers times 0.6 is 3 miles. Or if you're doing 100 kilometers per hour, you're doing 60 miles per hour. Just multiply by 0.6. Okay, well, this may or may not correspond to reality. Because under the hood, we have to know a few things. And what are the few things we have to know? Well, we have down here something called ground factor. Namely, every object within the environment has an effect on the signal, and the ground is one of those. And the ground can be hard, like water, where it's smooth and reflective, or it can be dirt, which absorbs a lot more of the sound. So, what does that mean? Well, on hard surfaces, the sound gets reflected more, and you hear it further distances. And for grasses and dirts and having trees and small little things on the ground, a lot more of the sound gets absorbed, and therefore it goes less distance for the same intensity. So, let's put everything back to where we had it, 1.5 meters off the ground. Now you'll see up here it's calculating, and we'll turn in. Right now I have the ground factor set at 0, which is the most reflective. So if we set this to 1, which is the most absorbs the most, and we hit that in there, then we see that, whoa, wait a minute here, now we've got a completely different picture. So going from a very hard surface to a very soft surface has a much bigger impact than going from ground elevation to 300 feet in the air. And so this is a factor which you have to take into account when you're doing your calculations or estimations or approximations for how far these sounds travel, for what intensity. So now you can see that the vast majority of the area within 3 miles is the purple, which is, in fact, it's way down there. Let's see, what's this one over there? Like 23. And so, to even get up to 60, with a ground that absorbs a lot, you have to get within, two little squares roughly of it. And two little squares, what do we say? Okay, each big square is 2.5 kilometers. There are 5 of them, and therefore each little square is 0.5 kilometers times 0.6, which would be 0.3 miles. So let's do that easier. Let's see. Each one of these is 0.5 kilometers. 0.5 kilometers, or 500 meters, would be 1,500 feet. So that's 3,000 feet. So you have to get within roughly 400 feet before you even get something that's audible over a conversation. Whereas when this was weighted at 0, you could go way out to, let's see, we'll just measure it in squares. 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. So almost double the distance. So the lesson learned here is that if you're grabbing a video from YouTube that shows an automatic weapon being fired either locally or downrange, and you see them firing on grass, then you got to, and you say, well, that's what things should sound like either locally or remote in Vegas. You better be darn well sure that the absorption by the ground is the same in that video as it was in Vegas. And Vegas wasn't always necessarily didn't absorb well. There's a lot of hard surfaces in Vegas, and so a good portion of the sounds, if you were firing it from ground level, would be reflected. Correspondingly, inside the venue where there's people, that's a lot of sound that can be absorbed by people, whether they're standing or laying down. That would be a soft surface. So we have to select a medium between the two, depending upon where the shooter was. Depending upon where the shooter was, you have to look at the surfaces involved and select a ground factor that's appropriate. And I've selected, about 0.5 because I know that the shooter was elevated, and I know that most of the sound was coming to the first 4 volleys anyway were coming to a region that was getting absorbed by the people. After the 7th volley, out there in the venue, you had some AstroTurf, which is not really a good absorber of sound, but it's not a hard surface either. And so I'll lower the absorption power of that surface when I'm thinking about running a simulation on the volleys that are 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. If I wanted to simulate a shooter at ground level, then I'd have to first pick a location. If I were to pick it, say, on the sidewalk past the Mandalay Bay, or even at the tram area without any trees, direct line of sight type thing, then the first part of that would be reflective, and I'd have to up into this, the time at which it enters a venue, in which case people are there, and therefore it's going to be more absorbing. So I'd have to run 2 simulations to give me an idea of what the sound would look like over the entire range of ground phenomena. So remember, the ground phenomena can have a very serious impact, more impact than whether you're at ground level or at an elevation. There's also the A weighting. So we have to look at A weighting, and we'll just take this. This is 1.5. This is a shooter at 1.5 meters, which means it's just standing with a gun in his hand. We've got a really reflective surface, and now we're going to go A weighting and see what happens to this circle here. So we hit A weighting, and it shrinks. Okay, so the A weighting is very commonly applied to recordings, kind of, after the sound is received, after it's adjusted, but before playback. So most of your Vegas videos that you get off YouTube are probably going to have some form of weighting, probably a weighting applied. So when you're sitting there adjusting your volume, you got to know that somebody's already tried to do that for you. So all you're doing is setting the scaling on that A weighting. Now, there's a good question. Well, what about gunshot sounds? Gunshot sounds and well, let's back up a minute here. The ear itself is a very complicated device, and it doesn't operate the same way that you think it operates. It isn't a linear device, it's nonlinear. And how you hear sounds, or in particular the loudness of them, is a function of many factors. The duration of the sound, the frequency of the sound, and the intensity of the sound. Short little pulses from guns, while they may be very large, aren't taken as loud as if the gunshot sound was very long. So the longer the sound occurs, the more power the ear interprets it, the louder it interprets it. The shorter it is, the less it interprets it for intensity. Similarly, things below 1,000 hertz are reduced, so the ear, doesn't give them as much weight, and above 5 kilohertz, the ear doesn't give them as much weight. And so the things in between 5 kilohertz and 1 kilohertz are given quite a bit of weight. So you see we have, the frequency, we have the intensity, we have the duration. And all these things come into the brain to mishmash together and give you an interpretation of the intensity of the sound. So as you can see, it's non-trivial. So what's on the recording is not what was live. That is, the sounds that were live are much, much different than the sounds we hear coming out of our speakers. And all this manipulation with the volume and the weighting and the automatic gain control, all that just lead to nightmares, headaches, when you're trying to compare the absolute value. You want to say, oh, the gunshot was at 145 decibels, and 300 foot away it was 120 decibels, and therefore we can do a bunch of calculations, but you can't. You simply cannot, because it may be the situation that for a short period of time, or for it may be the case that you're out there in the fields and it's let's pick a real example. Oasis Apartments. Oasis Apartments is close to, or maybe even further than 1,000 feet away from the Mandalay Bay. And out there, neither the sounds from the venue or the sounds from the traffic or even the sirens are very loud. So it's a really quiet environment. And so the muzzle sounds and the sonic wave, or the Mach wave as I call it, Mach wavefront, get out there and they're way reduced in volume, but because the background is quiet, you can still hear them and get a good recording. Now they're going to have their frequencies modified because the air absorbs the higher frequencies, so they're going to start to look the same. That is, the muzzle will start to look the same as the supersonic crack. But if you look at them carefully with the spectrogram, they are quite easily separated. And so that's an example of where the contrast of intensities between the background sound and the signal that you want to deal with, even though they're both really low, makes things easily accessible. Whereas in the venue, during the killing part, the first 4 volleys, where things were just pandemonium and there's screaming and everything, sometimes you can't even hear the gunshots over the screaming. They're there, but you just can't separate them out from all the intense noise that's happened, even though the intensity of those gunshot sounds is 1,000 times more than what's out at Oasis. And yeah, you heard me right, 1,000 times. And that brings us into another factor. The ear is not a linear hearing device. It is a logarithmic device. Logarithmic. Okay, here we go. I'm probably going to lose a bunch of viewers now at this point, but it's really quite simple. Let's talk about linear and logarithmic, because the ears, the eyes, and a bunch of other things in our common everyday life are logarithmic in nature, not linear. Well, you say, give me something I can work with here, Richard. Okay, fine. Your tape measure or ruler is a linear scale. As you go 1 unit to the right or left, you're measuring the same precise amount of distance. Okay? Let's take a real example of a semi-logarithmic scale, the piano. As you move up 1 octave, you are not moving up the same frequency. You are doubling the frequency each time. So if you go from 220 Hertz up to an octave, 440 Hertz to 880, then the change in frequency for the first octave was 220 to 440 or 220 Hertz. But for the second octave, it's 440 Hertz to 880, which is 440 Hertz. So it's double the same interval on the piano, an octave. Everybody knows what an octave is, 8 keys. In one case will be twice that of the next one. So that's a logarithmic scale. It doesn't move the same amount of frequency each time. In fact, on a piano, it doubles for each octave. Okay, that's what a linear scale is. Now, there's a more general way of explaining it, but we're not going to get into that tonight. Just know that your eyes, your ears, the piano, and a bunch of natural phenomena are better suited to measuring and looking at them with logarithmic scales, because that's how they operate. And decibels is a logarithmic scale. It's an arbitrary scale applied by man to sound, and we use it because it's a convenient way of dealing with things. If I had to deal with the absolute pressure of sound, we'd be talking about pascals or newtons per meter squared or pounds per square foot or something like that. Well, the range of the actual numbers for what the ear can hear varies by 15 orders of magnitude. 1,000,000 is 6 orders of magnitude. So 1,000,000 times 1,000,000 would be 12, times 1,000 would be 15 orders of magnitude. And we'd have to be talking about, numbers with, anywhere, bunches of zeros after or before the decimal point. So rather than having to use that in scientific notation and everything, we've created, as mankind has created, this scale called decibels. And it's nothing more than a scale called a bell, one bell. So this on a, over here, let's say bells. A decibel is nothing more than a bell multiplied by 10. Deci meaning 10. So here what we have, the purple is 4 bells. This is 5 bells, 6 bells, 7 bells, 8 bells, 9 bells, 10 bells, 12 bells. So I kind of jumped big there. And then 14 bells. But if we multiply them by 10, we get a little bit finer granulation. And that's where we come up with the decibels. For each change from 1 to 2 decibels, the amount of energy involved is 10 times. And going from 1 decibel to 2 decibels. Bells, not decibels, bells. So similarly, since it's multiplied by 10, if we go from 10 decibels to 20 decibels, that's a jump in energy by a factor of 10. Think about that. You say, doesn't sound right. All right, I'm from California, and I happen to be in the San Francisco, Silicon Valley Bay Area, whatever you want to call it, when the Loma Prieta earthquake hit. The Loma Prieta earthquake is measured on the Richter scale, which is a logarithmic scale, and it goes from 0 to 10, with each change in whole numbers being an energy magnitude greater by a factor of 10. Okay, so if we had an earthquake at 1 on the Richter scale, and just say that's the energy, and then we had a earthquake at 7, that would be 6 units higher, which means that the energy for the 7.0 earthquake is 1,000,000 times more than the energy for a 6.0, for a 1.0 earthquake. And so we need a little bit finer granulation than that, and that's why we say, 4.3 or 1.0 or 7.0 or 6.9. But you get the idea. Each unit that you go up on the Richter scale is 10 times more energy. And similarly on the decibel scale, it's the same exact concept. In fact, they could have used the decibel scale for the Richter for measuring earthquake power, but it's already overloaded enough. We use it for so many different things. Decibel is a unitless scale. It's really just the ratio of two numbers and their logarithm. And so it always needs a qualifier behind it. But the most common assumption when you say dB is that it's a unit for sound pressure level. And the decibel scale is arbitrarily fixed at the lowest possible sound that the human ear can hear if you're healthy, and they place that at 0 decibels, and at the largest scale all the way up to 19 bells or 190 some decibels, at which point the air is no longer going to operate properly and it becomes a shock wave. That's right, a shock wave. Whoa, wait a minute, Richard. We're talking about applying decibels to the shock wave. No, we're not. We're talking about applying decibel scales to the shock wave front. Okay, here's a little tidbit. When that bullet goes through the air, it creates a wave that the air cannot handle in terms of sound. And so it's this fine little thing right at the tip of the bullet, maybe even extending down a little bit, where the air no longer is, what do we call it? Oh, there's a term for it. I'll look it up later. But anyway, whatever energy gets put into it doesn't come back out in the form of sound. Part of it goes to heat. You see, if you apply a amount of energy into air that's less than 190 decibels, all of it will come back out in the form of sound waves. But over 190 decibels, then it's a shock wave, and the more pressure you apply, the more will come out in heat. And so, well, what's it take to get a shock wave? It takes a lot of pressure. But anyway, and another little tidbit is that, these decibel scale for the ears is not really absolute pressure, because the amount of pressure surrounding us at all times is 100,000 times, roughly speaking, just a rough 100,000 times greater than the pressure generated by this conversation into the microphone. It's a lot of pressure, but we're so used to it, we don't even notice. It's just like, there's an atmospheric pressure here on our skin. What is it? I've forgotten. 14.7 pounds per square inch. That's a lot of pressure. And if you don't believe me, just, go down in the water another 10 feet where you have another 16 pounds of pressure, and man, you'll know it immediately because you can't breathe. Which is why scuba tanks are pressurized. Alright, so I think I went too far into the weeds. Let's get back out here and look at some of the numbers for sound pressure. I have some scales up here. If we see which one I want to start with. Not that one, not that. Noise, what's this over here? No. Oh, here we go. Noise level chart. Alright. So here we have a chart of various sounds, their dBA. Now this, I think in this case, that's probably stands for decibels with the A weighting, although it could stand for absolute. I'm not sure which. For gunshots, you normally deal with straight decibels, but everything else is dB with an A weight on it. dBA. So anyway, let's just talk about it. Pin drop. Have you ever heard of pin drop? I bet you haven't, because you're normally in such and the noise, normally the noise around you is so great that that sound is indistinguishable from the noise. But I bet you reach for the volume, the control on a television where the sound of a pin dropping could be heard, because they've amplified it on the recording for the movie, and then you turn the sound up and all of a sudden the pin dropping sounds like thunderclap. But in fact, in real life, it's just above the threshold of hearing for a healthy ear. It's 10 decibels, 0.1 bells, and the amount of pressure needed to move the surrounding air around you is very, very small. Okay, so you can see with the greens here, which roughly corresponds to some of my green stuff over there, that a whisper is 30 decibels, a babbling brook is 40, whereas a conversation, our normal conversations are around 60 decibels. So if we go back over here to, where was this one? Oh, no, 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 no. There we are. No, that's not either. Here's where we were. Okay. So on this, where we're at, we have a muzzle sound at 1.5 meters above the ground, and we have a highly reflective surface. But let's go back out to no A weighting. I'll let it calculate there. Well, actually, let's put A weighting back on. And we wanted to get down to a normal conversation, which was 60. Then we'd have to go out. Let's see. Almost 2.5 meters, 2.5 kilometers, or what did I say? Times 0.6 would be 1.5 miles. Okay. So for highly reflective surface like water, if you were sitting on a raft and you fired a gun and the muzzle blast was 140 decibels, and that kind of is, you have to say how far away from the gun it is. So let's say a meter away from the gun you measured it as 140 decibels, which would be a really soft muzzle sound, by the way. Normally for a rifle these things are up in the 160 range. But I used 140 on this simulation because after all he was inside the room and it has to come out the window. But anyway, so if you had 140 decibel muzzle blast on a raft floating on the water with calm, i.e. no waves, then you could probably hear that for at least, well, it would be the same, it'd be as loud as a conversation 1.3 miles away. But if you were to do that same thing over grass by changing the ground factor to 1, then to get down to 60 decibels, which would be this little area right here, shoot, that's only half of one of those squares. And that's let's see, the whole thing was 2.5 kilometers divided by 500 meters. So half of that would be 250 meters, so 750 feet. By the time you were 750 feet away, so this would be a gunshot on a grass, and 750 feet away, the muzzle blast would already be about the same level as a conversation. So you can see there's a huge difference here based upon the type of the ground. And similarly, if we were to go up, and this is with A weighting, I think the other one was too, wasn't it? Anyway, if we were to go up to 300 foot, which will be 100 meters, oops, surprise. and this is something I wanted to show you anyway. An elevated shooter on grass makes the sound louder because less of the sound has to come across the grass. Okay? Whereas when you're at ground level, most of the sound has to go across the grass to get to you. But from an elevated shooting position, more of the sound gets to you. Now on a hard reflective ground, it's just the opposite, because you're dealing strictly with no absorption by the ground, but the absorption because of geometric spreading. Oh, and also while we're here, notice that I'm running most of these models at 27 degrees Celsius, which is about 80.6 Fahrenheit, and 20% humidity. And the elevation of Vegas would have some effect on this, but I don't know exactly how much. Okay, so let's see. We were back at the noise. We have to cover a couple more things here. So if we go over to Wikipedia here, you can see some more things here. Let's see. One thing you have to cover is the threshold of pain. The loudest, and we're going to, and that occurs somewhere in the 130 to 140 decibel range, and that's that's a AR-15 with a muzzle on it. I mean a silencer on it. A silencer drops roughly 20 decibels. So if the AR-15 with your favorite round was going to, at 1 meter away, was going to produce 160 decibel noise, then if you slap your silencer on it, it's going to drop at 20 decibels, roughly speaking, down to 140 decibels. So you can see that 120 decibel sound is still very loud. It's not quite as loud as the loudest human voice, but it's I don't know what the hell a Vuvuzu horn is, but it's certainly louder than a jet engine, or about as loud as a jet engine. And oh, this is a different, at 1 meter up there. This one must be somewhere else. So you can see, and you'll also notice up here, this one listed LRAD 1000 XI long range acoustic device, and it can produce signals as loud as 153 decibels. What this doesn't tell you is how confined that beam is, because since you can change it from a very narrow beam, in which case the 153 decibels goes out a long ways, or you could do it wide, in which case it would disperse fairly quickly. Not quite as much as a point source, but, and that's at 1 meter. Oh, anyway, you can look up the what was I doing? Oh yeah, threshold of pain. Above this, you're gonna get damage to your ears, and so when you're shooting a gun with no silencer on it, or without ear protection, you are causing damage to your ear every time it goes off. And let's see, and since that's probably on the order of 150 to 160 decibels that you're getting right smack dab into your ears, and that's what Paddock must have been experiencing. Every time he shot, it was painful. I'm sure it broke his eardrums. I'm sure he was bleeding out the ear. All right. Now, in terms of absolute value of pressure, just to give an example, we're going to take a 30-06 rifle being fired, and we're going to measure the sound at 1 meter to the right-hand side of him as 171 decibels, or 30 decibels above the threshold of pain. The absolute value of that is 7.27 by 10 to the 3, or 7,270 units of pressure. In this case, pascals, which is just a arbitrary kind of standard metric measurement for pressures. Okay. So remember that 7,000 pascals. Now, if we drop down to our normal conversation, let's see, where's our normal conversation? Down here. At the 40 to 60 range, the amount of pascals, and that's a 1 meter distance, you and I are talking 1 meter distant to each other, then we have 2 by 10 to the minus 3, which is 2 millipascals. Okay, and that's for the 40 decibel one. At the 60 decibel, it's 0.02, or 20 millipascals. So you can see that's a huge range of difference, and that's not even the entire thing. The absolute minimum sound that a good, healthy person can hear is 2 by 10 to the minus 5. So compared to normal conversation, that's 100 times softer. So you can see from there all the way up to, the 30-06 rifle. A lot of change. All right. And just for example, the Krakatoa, the third pressure wave created by the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, was 310 decibels. Of course, that's kind of nonsensical because above 190, you're no longer really talking about a sound wave, but you're talking about a shock wave with carrying a lot of heat with it. All right. One other thing we have to talk about before we can do much more with those graphs, and I'm going to do substantially more with the graphs to show you some interesting things, and that is how the human ear detects changes in intensity of sound. And to do that, let's see, there's this little chart I've got. There we go. Alright, now remember, a change in decibels of 10 is how much change in energy? Well, that's one whole bell, so that's 10 times. Okay? But yet to the human ear, it's only twice as loud. Now let me run that to you by again. For every 10 times change in energy, only generates about a twice as loud feeling to the human ear. And that's why we use the decibel scale, because otherwise it would look funny. It would be, oh, we go from an energy level of 1 to an energy level of 10, but it's only twice as loud. And so that little volume knob you have on all your devices, it's nonlinear also. It's not quite logarithmic, but it's not. It should be logarithmic, but it's not, because it's optimized for cost and effectiveness to your ear. So it really is a combination of just two or three curves. The low one being linear, kind of flat, and then it reaches this knee, and all of a sudden it just pops way up. So at the high end of your thing, you're generating massive amount more of power out of your speakers to get the same adjustment in upwards in loudness that you would expect by turning the knob the same distance. I know, tricky kind of stuff, isn't it? Yep, sure is. So anyway, if we have two sounds from two different we're comparing two sounds, when will we, the human being through our ears, be able to tell that there's a difference? And that occurs somewhere between 3 to 6 decibels. By 6 decibels, you can definitely tell that there's a difference in intensity or loudness. But at 1 to 3 decibels, not so much. Okay? And 10 decibels, which is 10 times the energy as the previous decibel level, as 1 decibel I should say, then, or 0 decibels. Let's go from 10 to 20. That's a 10 times change in energy, but only a 2 change in loudness to the ears. And you can, look at this chart. So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at these noise charts. So if we go back to the noise chart, I think, was I out here? Oh yeah. And we see, for example, from, well, I don't know, pick 2. This one here, 73.7 in this area to 64. So that's not quite a, let's call that one 7, not quite a 10 decibel change. So a 10 decibel change is going to sound twice as loud. So going from, well, let's presume that's up there at the top here, and going from 1.5 squares to 0.5 squares, which is a ratio of 3 to 1, we only get a doubling in intensity for this shooter at 100 meters in elevation from us. If we were to change that to the ground level, and that's for an absorptive ground with A weighting, if we were changed the shooter to be at 1.5 meters, how far would it take to get us a 10 decibel change? Much further, or not as far actually. So in this case, well, it's just a little further away actually. The distance between 71.2 and 61 is about 10, but the distances you'll notice is it's a little bit closer to the center of the muzzle. And that's what all these numbers out there mean. So anyway, um, the observation, so now you know what these numbers out there mean. You know how to read them. You know what this scale is, roughly speaking. You know, by the time you get up to 140, your ears are bleeding. A rock concert's around 90. Conversation's around 60. 4 is getting down there towards whispering. 40, rather. And the gunshot sounds that you hear on most of the Vegas recordings were probably happening somewhere between 100 and 120 decibels. 120 for the ones that were very, very close to the Mandalay Bay or very, very close to a bullet, either way. And I'll show you a few graphs here in a minute with that kind of modeling. So, the open field, as I would call it, open ground, no obstacles with a point source, isn't a very good model of Vegas whatsoever, regardless of what elevation you put these things in. So to try to get some idea of what was happening in Vegas, and this really is, you know, just a superficial modeling for proof of concept or whatnot. To do the real modeling is a tremendous amount of work, and I've barely scratched the surface on using the software that'll give me that capability. So let's go through my notes here and make sure I've covered most of this. So here was a simulation where we had the shooter at ground level. It was a very reflective surface, and of course we used the muzzle blast with the 140 decibel center frequency at 500. And then the second picture is after we applied A weighting, which, as you can see, for a shooter on the ground, when you apply A weighting to the signal, otherwise it shrinks, meaning that the sound, having been adjusted to what the human ear might think is the intensity, has smaller concentric circles. And then we raise it to 300 foot in elevation, and you can see that this without A weighting, and you can see that it's not as large as the ground level shooter has a much larger radius or diameter than the one at 300 feet. And this is because that since you're 300 foot higher, when the sound finally hits the ground, it's already dissipated to some extent. So these circles are smaller. And then that same graph there, but with the A weighting. So if you compare A weighting to A weighting, that one to this one, you can see that overall it shrinks too. Of course, a smaller circle after you apply A weighting is going to shrink it some more. Great. So now we go to a medium model for the ground, where it's not purely reflective, it's not purely absorptive, and we look at these, and once again we see that after you apply A weighting to the shooter at the ground, it's smaller. But let's compare this circle, which we'd expect to be smaller, to the one at the top, and let's see, we get the first indications of light blue at 1, 2, 3, and about 3.5 units out. Okay, and so here we see we get the first, did I say first or last up there? Let's see, that was the last. 1, 2, 3, yeah, the last vestige of the light blue would be 3.5 units. So by the time we say that the ground is half absorptive, or 0.5, then to get to the last vestiges of the light blue, we got 1.5. So, and that's at ground level. So as you can see, as we increase the as we decrease the hardness or increase the absorptive power of the ground, then it takes less distance to reduce the overall sound intensity from the muzzle. And similarly, after applying A weighting, it's smaller. Then we go to 300 feet. Now, this is where, it got kind of interesting, because we see at 0.5 hardness and at ground level, it took a little over 1.5 to get to the blue, and down here it takes about 2. So even with a hardness of 0.5 and elevated at 100 meters, 300 feet, we see that now, because of the fact that at ground level, over a surface that absorbs, being up in the air or being elevated has an advantage in terms of giving you a bigger sound arena or bigger sound environment. And then, of course, A weighting does the usual thing. Now, if we go to a really absorptive ground, then here at the ground level, the sound gets absorbed very quickly, and it's only half a little square before the edge of the light blue region is reached. And then for the elevated, let's see, elevated. Okay, this one's A weighted, then we got that and that. Okay, yeah. So here it's about 1, 1.5, and back up here it was about less than 1. So again, even at the highly absorptive, you still get a larger area elevated than you do at the ground level. Let's see. One of these may have been at 15 meters. Okay. So anyway, the next thing I did was to insert a building at the same point at which the muzzle is originating, which is a good approximation to that side of the Mandalay Bay. And we could then generate the sound pattern. And as you can see here, at 100 feet, 300 feet in elevation, everything else being the same. And then from here on out, I used a ground absorptive number of 0.5, and everything is A weighted, because I feel that that's more realistic to what we're getting out of the Vegas recordings than not. So if we put a building behind it, then that building blocks all the sounds from going behind it, which means that all the sounds have to stay in front. And at this point, I've also added a 1.5 meter high concrete barrier about 700 foot away, along with a little bitty tent there, which I could never get to work because this program is very, very simple. And here we can see that, on a scale where, what's this? Let's enlarge it a little bit here if I can. Oops, that was a little too much. 1 kilometer. Okay, so a big square is 1 kilometer, so a little square is 200 meters. Okay. So 200 meters. So here we can see that a muzzle blast stays pretty intense out to 100 meters, and then starts drifting off and drifting off and drifting off. And by the time you're out here on Giles, you've lost 70 decibels, but that's still audible over a normal conversation. In here, if you have high power music going at 90 dBs, that would not be audible. Okay, but there's this barrier out there has no effect. This was at 100 meters, right? Come on, Richard. Well, we'll find out in the next one. Yeah, that was at 100 meters. 100 meters at elevation. If we drop the elevation of the shooter down to 15 meters, which is about 45 feet, say on top of the tram building, then you get some modification at longer distances here. As you can see that the green area isn't quite as spherical or circular as it used to be. Up here it's this nice circle, but this 1.5 meter barrier now is having an effect on everybody who's behind the barrier for quite a while. Probably not that noticeable. You'll see that there's only 3 decibel change over 100 meters, or 200 meters rather. And so that's not much of a change. Remember, 3 decibels is barely noticeable. But you'll notice some strange phenomena start happening out here at the north end of that barrier, where you get the effects of the sound coming from the source, and since it's at such an angle to the barrier, it reflects off the barrier rather than going over the top. And here at the edge, then that creates an extra shadow. So when we drop down to a shooter at ground level, you go, holy moly, then there's a radically larger effect. The barrier, even though it's only 1.5 meters tall now, is at the same elevation as the shooter, 1.5 meters, and everything on the other side of the barrier has the signal dropped by 20 decibels, roughly speaking. And it's lesser the closer you get to the south end of the barrier, but up here at the north end with 63 decibels on one side, or maybe, and 73 on the other, that's 10 decibel drop. And everybody going out there would not notice things as much. So if you have a shooter at ground level, there's going to be radically different characteristics on the ground from an elevated shooter. An elevated shooter gives you this more uniform semicircular pattern, whereas a shooter on the ground is going to give you all sorts of variations in patterns. And this is just with that one little barrier out front. You got all sorts of buildings and tents and other barriers here, and I haven't even begun to try to model them with this program because it just doesn't have that capability. And if we look a little closer at that barrier and we go all to the south end, then we can see that up close the scale here is 2.5 meters per big square, and since there's 5 of them, that's 0.5 meters per little square. And you remember a meter is about 3 foot, so this is about 1.5 feet. You'll see that when you're up close to the barrier, i.e. down there ducking below it, then you get, we go from 82 to 75. So that's 7 decibels difference by jumping behind the barrier at least. Now this is on the south end. In the middle, we get we go from 72 to 62, so we still get about a 10 decibel drop, although you notice overall the further north we go, the less the sound is because we're further away from that elevated shooter. And then finally, but nothing real strange here, but then on the north end, when you take an up close look, you see all sorts of interesting things. You notice that we have, well, let's just do some drawing here. You notice that we have this area. We'll notice this one. You notice this, and you notice all these little things here. And then you notice, of course, that it's a much bigger shadow than at the south end, or even in the middle end. And this is for a shooter at 1.5 meters above the ground. And this type of happening would occur for every single barrier of any nature that was in the way of the sound from where the shooter would be. So this is, once again, one of the reasons that a ground level shooter just isn't a viable thing, because the nature of the sounds that were recorded are more consistent with being evenly distributed, as in the patterns that I showed you earlier, like this or this. Now, I haven't got into a lot of detail otherwise with these things, but this is a tool where you can use and play with and become familiar with some of the things. Now let's see. So after I got done playing with this barrier there and was kind of delighted, I went on and I added a sonic wave. Now this program doesn't model conic things, so I just had to use a point source, which is an extremely poor model for a supersonic crack. But anyway, for a supersonic crack, I modeled it with this spectrum, where the highest intensities are recorded around 2 kilohertz and pretty high at 1 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, but below 500 it's dropping off very rapidly. Okay, so here on this one we have at the little area up here where the muzzle is at this is probably 100-foot elevation, isn't it? Oh, I'd added the second barrier down here too. So we added a second barrier, which is on the east side of the venue, and I added a supersonic projectile going 15 foot overhead just on the boulevard side of the first barrier, and I said, what does this pattern look like here? Well, remember now that supersonic crack, the spectrum we used, has a higher frequency. So the closer we get to the supersonic crack generation point, you'll see that this curve represents the spectrum, just like you'd see on my spectrographs. There's more peaks to the right, whereas with the muzzle blast over here, if you had a receiver there, there's more peaks to the left. So you can see how going from one point to the other, let's see, these once again, these are at 250 meters for a big square, 50 meters there, 150 feet. So to go from this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that'd be about 800 meters. So if we went from 800 meters towards and away from the supersonic crack generation point, you would see the sound radically shift towards the supersonic crack over to the right here, and way to the muzzle over there. So these sounds mix, and if the bullet sound, if the supersonic crack from one round occurs at the same time as the muzzle of the other, then you're going to get this mixture that's hard to separate. Many of the times in Vegas they were separated in time also, and this program does not give me the ability to make that model. Okay, well, anyway, I've covered quite a bit of this thing, so let's review this. And what does it all mean? Well, we got these nice little pretty pictures and patterns and everything. It means that it's hard to make real good, accurate estimates of what's happening in Vegas without running a full tilt simulation, but we can get some rules of thumb. And what we also can say is that pulling a video off YouTube of an automatic 308 where you're 15 foot away and you're behind the shooter is going to give you very little information about what's happening at 300 meters or further in the down range. And you have to also know, and even if you did have a video recording that, you'd have to know what the ground is compared to Vegas and all this other stuff. So people coming along and saying this YouTube video of somebody making a recording of a 308 automatic sounds like what was happening in Vegas, you know, I just don't buy it. And I don't buy it because they probably got their hand on the volume control making them the same sound intensity, right? I mean, after all, you adjust it up and down to where you can hear it good, and they haven't taken into account any of the other things. So, anyway, this is just another tool I bring to your attention to help you understand what's happening with these sounds and how they work, how they don't work, and what things really mean. And I hope it, oh, and I did explain the decibel scale. I'll be going into great detail on decibels in 2 or 3 separate videos at some point in time, because they're worthy of, drilling into your brain what a decibel is. Because you hear it all the time, not only in acoustics, you hear it in all of your instrumentation, and there's just a whole group of things. As one example, when you're on the, let's see, if we go back down here, there we go. When you're on the uphill side meaning on the source side of that barrier, what happens to the sound on the uphill side of the barrier? Well, depending upon the height of the barrier, when a sound comes in, you'll hear the primary sound, and then you hear the sound reflected from the barrier, and that'll increase the average sound pressure by a certain amount 3 decibels, typically speaking, for a small one like that. And you have to understand what 3 decibel means. Well, in terms of our hearing, 3 decibels is barely noticeable, but it's a substantial increase in power. And when you're looking at the spectrograms, we're not listening with our ears, we're looking at the absolute values, which is much more accurate. You know, a 10 times increase in amplitude on a spectrogram is going to be radical, but a 3 decibel increase in power on your spectrogram is still going to be noticeable if it's in a frequency band that's different than the surrounding areas. And certainly a 6 decibel, which is a doubling in amplitude on your waveform, or even in your spectrogram, that's going to be much more brilliant in color. So all these things mean something, and you have to understand that, you know, if you have 2 angles here, if there was a barrier where if you were stuck in a corner with a wall on each side that were 10 foot high and there were gunshot sound coming at you, then you would hear the primary signal, a reflection from one wall and a reflection from the other wall, and on average you get a 6 dB increase in the sound pressure, or a 6 dB gain, as they would call it. So these little things you have to understand. Or if you're around a corner, how much decibels are going to be lost, or if you have something overhead, how much decibels are going to be lost in your signal. All of these things matter, and all of these things help you estimate and make sense of what happened or didn't happen that night in Vegas. Okay, I think I've drug on enough here. Let me just briefly go through this, see if there's something I missed. Oh, that was other alternative test there. I don't think I've missed anything. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, one other thing. Let's go to noisetools.net. The noise mapping is what we've been using. They also have a decibel calculator, which is good for adding them together, because remember, multiplying logarithms is the same as adding. But they also have, oh yeah, here we go. Here's something we can play with too. And maybe I'll just do another video on it. But this gives you the ability to simulate a barrier, and then look at what the resulting pressure level will be behind the barrier. And you know, you can change the source level and frequency. Let's say this was 140 decibels. Okay, and the distance from source, let's put that at 450 meters. Okay, and then let's move this barrier. Let's say a 1.5 meter barrier, which is what we had, and we're going to be the receiver. Where's the receiver height here? Maybe we can just, yeah, the receiver height is if we adjust it like that, you can see that the decibels go up and down. So this gives you a good way of you know, calculating some of the effects. In this case, you'll see that the barrier had little. Well, we'd have to get down here, over here in the region over here, to make it into the gray area, to have it reduce it substantially over and above what it did by geometric spreading. But anyway, you know, if you were to increase this a little bit, you'd see how the decibels go down, or bring it closer, it goes down. But you see, it doesn't really reduce it to 0. So this will give you another tool where you can play with and understand the effects of barriers or absorbing things. And you can not only do tonal, but you can do multi-spectrum. So it's just another tool. Anyway, now that's enough for this evening. We'll grab you in the next one.